Imagine that your D&D party is sailing on a ship and getting ready to dock in a nearby village. When the ship rounds the corner and you have sight of the village, or what should be the village, you see that it's gone. Something, a monster, a hurricane, whatever, has destroyed this once humble village and left it in ruin and debris. This is the exact scenario that my D&D group was about to encounter in one of our upcoming sessions, and I wanted to run a little encounter on this beach, and I realized I don't have anything that fits this kind of terrain at all. So naturally, I got to crafting, and I made a small, little, ruined beach village battle map. I want to show you guys exactly how I made that with a little bit of scatter terrain so that if you are ever in a very unique situation like this too, you can do it as well. It's a super quick and easy project. It probably took me like the equivalent of maybe 4 or 5 hours to put the whole thing together, and it looks really great. And now I have beach terrain. So let's show how I made it. To get started, we're going to need some varying pieces of MDF board that we're going to cut down to varying sizes, both for the base of the board and then the bases of the scatter terrain. We're also going to need some Mod Podge to glue everything down, including this fine ballast and some flocking. Then we're going to use some grout to also enhance that ballast and give the sand some variation, and glue all of this down with some scenic cement and some spray adhesive. So typically I like to use 1-inch thick foam glued to plywood and maybe use a plaster material or something on top for the ground texture, but for this I'm going to experiment a little bit and just use the raw MDF board to create the base for this beach. So MDF board and other thin porous boards like this are extremely prone to warping. So one of the first things you can do to try and discourage that is to round out the edges to give it a little bit less to pull up on. And then when you go to seal it, like I'm about to do here with the Mod Podge, make sure you do it on all of the edges and on both sides. Now we're just going to take some of this fine ballast and sprinkle it around randomly onto this Mod Podge to get the base for our sand, glue that down with some scenic cement, and then we're going to go over the top of it again with some fine grout just to give it some variation in texture and color. I'm going to use the spray adhesive here to help glue that down. You could use just this or just the scenic cement though. Now, I want to go ahead and flock this as well. I'm going to use the really bright green flocking on the edge, and then the closer it gets to the beach, I'm going to use more of that burnt color and just create a few patches here. Now that we have the base for this beach, we have to start working on the scatter terrain. Now the idea for this encounter was that my players were sailing up to a ruined beach village, so there has to be a lot of debris. I have varying pieces of craft wood and dowels and skewers and things like that that I'm going to break up to create some cool looking debris. I'm also going to use this twine, which is going to be unraveled to create some thatched roofs, lots of things to cut with, a knife, scissors, etc., and then also a wire brush. This little bit of chipboard or thin cardboard is going to come in handy for one of the larger terrain pieces you'll see in just a moment, and then we need to be able to glue it all together, and I find a hot glue gun works best. I've made some bases here with that MDF that I'm going to use for the scatter terrain. So without any rhyme or reason, I just started taking the craft wood and breaking it up into a bunch of little bits and started gluing it on. The idea here was that I was going to glue everything down that was touching the base itself, and then flock that with some sand, and then go back with some more pieces of the craft wood and build up on top of those. Let's take that twine I mentioned earlier and cut it up into tiny little pieces here, and then I'm just going to use my hand to unravel the twine so that I get a lot of really thin strands. I'm just going to clump these together and make these broken pieces of thatched roof. Speaking of thatched roof, I thought it would be really cool if I actually had an entire roof that had been blown off of a destroyed building. So now I'm going to work on a larger terrain piece here. I cut up the MDF board, sanded the edges, and I'm going to start working on the frame for this roof. I'm going to cut up these skewers for the frames, and then I'm going to use this chipboard as the base for the roof structure. I'm going to mark here on the base where I want that roof to sit, so that way I don't impede where I'm going to glue. And now I'm just going to take some extra debris, really make this look chaotic, and spread it all around the base. For a moment here, I thought about using craft sticks as the base underneath the thatching, then I just decided against it. Now that this is all glued together, it's time to start working on that thatched roof. I'm going to use a modified version of the tutorial from the crafting muse that I picked up a while back, and I have used it to make all of my thatched roofs. You essentially glue a piece of twine to the end of this cardboard and then wrap it around until it looks like this. Run your glue gun down the edge of each side of this. I'm going to do that on all four, I guess you could call it all four of the edges. You'll see here in the video exactly how that's done. And then we're going to start making some varying cuts, and you'll see how it all kind of comes together in just a moment. So my first cut is going to be right down this edge here so that I can take this off of the piece of cardboard. Now I'm going to cut right down that fold again so that I have two strips, and then I'm going to take each of these and cut right down the fold again. So now you see why having those four different lines of hot glue makes sense, because each line is essentially holding this all together. Now for the bits that aren't glued together, I'm going to just start unraveling these with my hand and then using the wire brush to try and speed things up a bit until they come out looking separated and frayed. And then just like we do with strips of roof shingles made out of foam, we are going to glue these onto the base until we have a thatched roof. I decided I wanted to hide the beam on top too, so I just took some pieces of unraveled twine and glued those to hide it. Since this roof is supposed to look weathered and beat up, I'm going to take a homemade brown wash and just run it all over this twine. Now, I've done this before. It looks a little bad going on at first, but you just have to trust the process. It looks great when it's all done. So just as an added bonus effect, I decided to burn a few matches and use the ends of those to create some ashy looking effects on this terrain. Just because it's supposed to look beat up and destroyed, I thought maybe a few burn marks would be cool. Another last minute addition I had was to take some grass tufts that I had lying around and glue those onto these bases, just to create a little bit of variety. And here's how everything looks so far. So I decided I wanted some palm trees for this beach as well. I'm going to use some pre-made trees that I found at a crafting store and glue them to these washers here just to make sure that they're weighed down. I'm also going to use a ground texture to cover those up, which I use this Vallejo one, but you could easily just use sand and PVA glue, which I've done many times in the past. And then I'm also going to use these rattle cans to add some zenithal highlights before I paint them up and make them look like the one you see here. So we're going to start by taking those trees, like I said, and just using hot glue to fasten them to these really heavy washers. While those dry, I still had a couple little MDF bases left over and decided I was going to make some long grass. I know a lot of times when you go to the beach, like before you get to the area where there's actually, the beach, there tends to be a lot of really tall grass, and so I decided I wanted to have that effect too. I'm taking some pre-made long grass here, just cutting it up. I believe this is Woodland Scenics, and I'm just hot gluing it onto the MDF base and then spreading it apart once it dries. I had a last minute change of heart here for that last base, and I thought it might be cool if they had some kind of cover to hide behind on this map, so I decided to have a piece of a house that looked like it had been buried in the sand, maybe a small wall, and I just glued that together and it looks like this. So here's what those trees look like with the zenithal highlighting. Admittedly, I did not record myself painting them, but this is what they look like after using some speed paints. I know earlier I said that I used the Vallejo ground texture, but in post I realized that I didn't. I just ended up painting them and then using the sand and the grout like I did with everything else. And speaking of which, here's what all of those extra pieces look like after I use the grouting and the flocking. And finally, this is the finished product. And just like that, you have your little ruined beach town. So I ran the encounter for this. It ended up being a lot of fun, and I think all of this was well worth it just for that quick little battle, because it brought the ruined village to life a little bit, and it only took me a few hours to make the whole thing. And at the very least, I get this cool destroyed roof, or maybe I could use that as like a tent or something in the future. And I also got these cool palm trees. So very reusable. Easy to do. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.